Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon on this webinar on dealing with the effects of stress. My name is Andrew Sodoli. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and certified addiction counselor, and I've been working in the behavioral health space with first responders and with trauma for quite some time. I want to thank everybody in the audience for being here. Of course, it's one of the sort of strange things about this is that the more sort of stressed we are, the less we find time to be able to cope with stress. So if you're attending today, it's obviously a sign that this is something that's important to you and that you're looking for some resources. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel, very distinguished panel, and I would like to start out with Dr. Edward Ratouche, who is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. He brings to bear more than 20 years of experience in mental health and substance use disorders. Next is Dr. Bob Lin, clinical psychologist. He's an academic. Also, I believe that we are talking about 40 years of experience with Dr. Bob. His resume is really too long for me to cover, but he has been in advocacy, in academia, and has been a luminary in leading for outcomes for behavioral health. And then I wanted to talk about Dan Malloy, who is also on the panel, and he has long experience with police, international order of police. First questions, you can see, please, I'd like to encourage the audience to look at the Q&As. We are really looking to reflect your questions. We have some that are already provided by previous audience. Like to know if there's anything in particular that you would like to be able to have answers to. So perhaps we can start with Dr. Bob. One of the conversations that's been happening a lot is in a COVID time, under the sort of stress, how do we recognize normal symptoms of stress, which is part of the operational sort of workload, as opposed to signs of extra stress during this pandemic, or perhaps as a result of burnout?
Well, you know, that's a great question, Andrew. Thank you. And thanks for the kind introduction. To talk about someone's normal reaction to stress is very difficult because people react in so many different ways. And, we all have ways that we show our vulnerabilities. And some of us will get more anxious and or depressed, we'll have emotional reactions. Some will have physical reactions. Some will have behavioral reactions. So for people in general, it's very hard to say, well, there's always these kind of ladies' home journal lists that you get that say, well, eat better, exercise and sleep, and sure. And if we came on to tell you those things, then you really don't need to be here. We all know those things. The real question is, why don't we do them? And what is it about us that is changing now that's different than before? And that really comes from knowing the people around you and knowing when their behaviors are really aberrant and they're not really what you would expect. And certainly there are some universal symptoms like isolation and extreme sadness and things like that. But knowing the people around you and having a open and honest relationship really facilitates the understanding of when people are in distress. What do you think about that, Ed?
Yeah, no, 100%. It's a very wide thing. I guess I first want to say that it's not by accident that we're all doing this. It's because we think the audience for this conversation might have the most to gain. In many ways, it's the participants of the webinar that are the pioneers of trying to kind of move this type of content forward, because it's your peers and yourselves that are most vulnerable to breakdown in the current environment. And I think if we're going to talk about the concept of stress and we're going to also talk about self-care, like everyone needs self-care, right? But for the frontline folks, you know, it's particularly unique. And I guess I almost wanted to ask the question to you, Bob, like, why is this population particularly of interest to guys like you and me who, you know, I was going to ask you a different question. I was going to ask you, how many years have you used the name Dr. Bob?
You know, it's interesting, Ed. When I give a talk and I'm introduced as Dr. Bob, and there's a young person in the audience, I have to tell him I'm not that Dr. Bob. You know, I mean, you know, he's died many years ago, but I only look like him. But it's only been 50 years. But that's you know, that question of that, your thought is really a very important one. You know, and the question of you know, how is this population different, and why is it that we need to focus on this population? And that is because, in general, this population has a rhythm, if you will, a way of dealing with incidents. You know, critical incidents response is what this audience does, and they do it on a regular basis, and they've learned, you know, organically how to respond, how to come back, how to find their homeostasis again, how to get back in balance, and then move on to the next one. And they've been doing that for years, and that's really fine. The problem, the difference is here that they don't have the time to rebound. The incidence is not only on a regular basis, but it's multiple incidents, and it's on multiple levels. So now you have a family at home who can't go outside. You may have kids that you need to educate. You may be worried about bringing your COVID back to the house. You're dealing with multiple issues on the ground in your work every single day, and you come into, when the moment you go to work, that incidence is still high. So you never get that time to rebound, to come back into your homeostatic, your balance, so that you can get on to the next one. So your normal method of living your life, which is really what you chose, that's what you want to do, that's what drives you. I mean, that adrenaline is part of your life, and that's not a negative thing. The negative thing is when you keep that, and you know this better than I do, Ed, when you keep that adrenaline switch on, you know that's finite. You can't keep that on forever and keep going, and at some point you run out, and that's when you reach that level of pathology. Does that make sense?
1,000%. I was kind of provoking you to say exactly that, to be honest, and that's because it leads to this kind of great. Look, I'm going to admit this. I watch a lot of UFC. I'm a fan of mixed martial arts. I'm a fan of combat sports, and one of the things I learned after being a 20-year fan is that there's a lot of technology when it comes to monitoring the health of an athlete, and these are superb athletes. You know, they sometimes walk around with resting heart rate of under 40 beats per minute. And they could do 3 hours in the gym twice a day for a 10-week training camp. But they also get monitored with a simple heart rate monitor. And if their resting heart rate in the morning is 10 beats above their baseline, they don't work out that day. So even though they're superb athletes, just like you said, conditioned first responders are well conditioned to the type of traumatic events that, you know, ride-along guys would fall apart on. if they had the same consistency of events. And yet, there's still breaking points. So despite the callous, the emotional, psychological callous of first response that most professionals have developed, they're still the most vulnerable to that breaking point, which I want to take it back to the original question about the signs of someone, falling apart emotionally. Well, it's everything, which is what you were saying, but let me break it down. Usually it takes this much for me to yell at my kid. Now it takes this much for me to yell at my kid. Usually it takes that much for me to have a certain response. Now it takes less. I have less tolerance in all areas that challenge me to be tolerant. All right, that's a sign, almost like a heart rate change in the fighter. So the real thing to recognize is that as a first responder, you're kind of in the red zone by the definition of your job. So it's almost peculiar why, Dr. Bob, how come we haven't done this sooner?
I think you're spot on. And, I like to call it pre-incident preparedness as opposed to critical incidents reaction. We know all about critical incidents reaction, and everybody knows about debriefing and all of those kind of things. And for me, it's about making sure that when you get to that incident, you're not already standing on the edge. You see, in my mind, it's never the critical incident that does you in. It's the fact that when you reach the critical incident, you were already on the edge and you got pushed over. I mean, that for me is the reason why different people, have different responses to the same incident. If it would, I don't believe the incident itself causes the stress or causes the pathology. I believe what causes the pathology is the cumulative effect of incidents and where you are prior to the incident. That's why, for instance, when the World Trade Center came, some people viewed it on TV and broke down and used drugs and did all other kinds of things, and other people were able to process it and go on with their life. It was the same incidents for the same people. The only thing, the difference was they started at a different point. Does that make sense to you, Ed?
Yeah, can I jump in just a second and ask you both? We're talking about a sort of baseline as far as any individual. And what I'm wondering is oftentimes we find ourselves that we only recognize that the baseline has shifted through sort of hindsight, right? Through a realization that things are not well, because we get used to sort of the baseline shifting. Oftentimes it just happens, it's like that water becoming hotter 1 degree at a time. Would you maybe sort of help to expand on some of you said everything, but can you expand maybe on both the psychological and the physiological and how those intersect for a first responder, so that perhaps in being preemptive, we're able to be kind of identify some problem areas and notice our baseline shifting?
That's a great question, Andrew, because, and this goes back, Dr. Ed, this goes back to your something you said. I mean, about first responders and why they are that community requires special attention at this time. And Andrew was just asking about physiological versus emotional and psychological, and the fact is that very often, or at least in many of the context that they work in, that people who are first responders work in, the emotional is not really available. It's not part of the context. You're not expected to show emotion. You're not expected to be sad, to be depressed. You're expected to be strong. You're expected to be in the hero mode, not in the victim mode. And when you get into the victim mode, you're really in deep trouble. So very often what we see in first responders is physical responses to problems. But for me, and again, in my thinking, by the time you have those kinds of symptoms, you're no longer early stage. Those are not early symptoms. For me, by the time that happens to these strong people, these heroes who are out there every day, by the time they have those symptoms, you're way down the road towards being in trouble. So it's really important to intervene long before either the physical or the emotional come to play. But that's, what do you think, Doctor?
Yeah, I was kind of meditating on that in a sense, because you're absolutely right. You know, if you see the following, it means that whatever you were doing for maintenance and as far as your self-care goes has failed, because those are the emerging symptoms of someone who needs more interventions, right? If a colleague at work is on edge all the time and is kind of yelling when they don't need to yell, and seems to be aggressive at times where they don't need to be, and may seem to be tired, and mentions that they're not sleeping well, or that they've lost their appetite, or that they're getting into arguments with their spouse. These are all signs that whatever was supposed to be there for the maintenance of the person's psychological well-being has failed them and needs to be restructured, needs to be addressed. So I agree. And that's why, you know, the idea of self-care, we all need self-care. And I think one of the things that is very true for all of us as human beings is that we offer ourselves less self-care than we actually need. We don't, like, think about our bodies. How many people actually know every inch of their own body? You know, it's the only body we're ever going to have, and we don't even know every inch of it. And certainly when it comes to our emotions, especially if we're in professions where there's a focus on the success of the task, sense the emotions, you know, it's not going to be there to be addressed. And yet it's the most vulnerable in these environments where you're always dealing with high adrenaline levels of every other participant in the situation. Every time a first responder shows up, everybody else in the situation is at a 9. Like, that's the beginning of every relationship on the job. That's phenomenal. That's a phenomenally dangerous thing for a person's emotional well-being.
It's a great point. And I also really, I was interested in, you know, what you said about athletes and sort of monitoring. And it makes me think that all first responders, before they go out on shift, they're generally checking their equipment, right? They go through a series of protocols and procedures to make sure that the equipment they're working with is functioning and is going to do the job. So to some extent, the most important part of that equipment is the brain, the mind, right? That whole person. How do we engage in that sort of type of basic sort of functioning check that the CPU is basically going to be able to operate all the equipment it has effectively and safely?
You know, Andrew, it really reflects back to what Dr. Ed was saying about self-care. And in terms of checking your equipment, I think it feeds in really well. But, you know, even the concept of self-care, you know, the training is, you know, highly focused on caring for others and dealing with the critical incident as opposed to dealing with self. So that self-care is not at the top of the list, even though it is, as you point out, Andrew, it certainly is part of the, you know, the resources, part of the, you know, what should be in the knapsack, the tool chest for moving forward should be self-care. It should be, you should be ready. You should be on the ready for that incident. You should be in a place where when Ed points out that you're going to be in such a brilliant remark. I mean, an insightful remark. You're you know, the context you're working in, as you pointed out, Dr. Ed, is just the so highly charged to begin with. But in a sense, you know, so if you're dealing with those, you know, number 9 people, you need to come in at a 5. You know, if you come in at a 9 and you're trying to deal with the 9, you know, that's a synergy that's going to just explode, as you said. So, you know, if you're going to de-escalate, you better be coming in at a lower level, because otherwise you're not going to be able to de-escalate. And if it's drawing from your finite resources, if you're coming in with finite resources, you've used up all of the emotional strength, all of the physical strength, all of the psychological strength in your toolbox, and you're coming into this situation, which is on multiple levels right now, you're apt to go into a deficit rather quickly.
Yeah, I was thinking how, you know, if you don't maintain your equipment, it's not going to work very well for you, right? And there are certainly those people out there, certainly athletes, we've seen them, who want to just go and perform and not exercise their equipment. And I guess I'm thinking that because of the stress load on this particular community, they have to engage with self-care with the same intensity and the same routine and vigor that they engage stress in their career. And if they don't, it's kind of an unfortunate abandonment of the maintenance of the equipment that they need to maintain. You know, so you know, and we could go down the line of what self-care might look like and how to do it in today's kind of more, even a hotter environment.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, sometimes terminology comes with its own connotations, but as you were talking about sort of coming into a situation where everybody's emotional sort of status is at a 9, I'm thinking that basically what a first responder does when they arrive on the scene is they take command of the situation, right? And in a way, command of the situation, being able to mediate all the participants' central nervous systems and their sort of trauma responses is really the most efficacious way of taking command of the situation, other than dealing with, you know, sort of dangerous or fires or things like that. But that in fact, part of the job isn't just dealing with a logical crisis, but it's dealing with the crisis of the individuals who are there and being able to negotiate and work with those individuals and sort of bringing the levels down. And that's what sort of command of the situation kind of looks like in a way. Wondering your thoughts on that.
We go. Well, yeah, I think you're exactly right, and you know it's so insightful that you know so timely that you talk about that, because I think it's really a sign that not only do we need to address the stresses of today, but we need to think about the stresses of tomorrow. And what I mean by that is that I would suggest that if there is a new norm in dealing with critical incidents, and we're talking about new ways of dealing with critical incidents, and particularly on multiple levels as we're dealing with them today, we better start talking about new ways of taking care of the first responders moving forward, and changing the way the thinking is constructed and the way the training is coming in, because I think it's more than just simply self-care. I think it's organizational and personal preparedness that's going to be needed moving forward.
That's like, yeah, the institutional changes. You know, when you were commenting about how it's not part of the protocol, it's not in the manual to have an emotional response to a shitty situation that you are now a part of trying to like figure out and, you know, take care of people in. Yeah, it's not in the manual. So yeah, a lot of institutional change needs to happen to address the community of first responders 1,000%. But I also wanted to return back to what Andrew was saying about leadership in an environment of first response, and how much the emotional climate, if you will, of a person dictates what others do. And it reminded me of in a way, it's an example of leading by example, right? If you're in an environment where you are completely confident and relaxed, and you know, we sense each other in ways beyond visual. Others follow suit. And the science behind this comment for me really comes from studies that looked at apes, mother apes, I think they were chimpanzees, and their newborn babies. And they were in captivity, and they were two different groups, and both groups were given equal amounts of proper nourishment. No animal was made to be hungry. And the only difference was one group was getting nourishment at a very regular interval, and the other group was getting nourishment at a random interval. And what they were able to detect was anxiety in the babies, because the babies felt the mother's anxiety. So the stress of not knowing when the food's going to come, even though they had adequate food and they were never hungry, was transmitted, not just felt by the mom, but it was transmitted to the baby. So we know that we could communicate emotionally with one another, and the leadership in first response is the reason why they're the leadership. They have to be leaders in every element of how to do the job properly. And the job without an emotional response is not an accurate definition.
You know, what you bring up there, you know, the door that you're opening here, Dr. Ed, is so important. The other piece to that is that community, whatever the community is, whatever the system is, when one person is in trouble, very often everybody's in trouble. And there's a multiplier effect to people's, you know, it's almost like a domino effect. You know, we impact on each other, you know, emotionally. And when there's stress among the organization, it tends to be, you know, like a contagious rash. And when that stress is at the top, when that's the leadership, then it just, you know, permeates all the way down. So it's really important that there's a organizational method of dealing with this, you know, before it becomes, if you will, you know, epidemic in that context. It really needs to be, you really need places. So the way that you can typically do that is when whatever is the normal response to whatever stress there is, and there ought to be some kind of baseline that people are familiar with. When that baseline is starting to be assaulted, it's time to have an intervention, not wait till the entire organization is in trouble.
Right, thank you. We actually have a question from one of the audience, which actually sort of ties into one of the early question of why working with this population. The question is, what do I do if my coworker is confiding in me they're struggling? They ask me not to disclose, but I am worried about them. What should I do? And I just want to remind us on the panel, and then of course everybody who's listening, that you know, substance abuse rates and suicidality rates amongst first responders are astronomical, 5 to 10 times higher than the general population. So ultimately, this is a population that is at risk, and I think this question sort of really sort of addresses some of the issues. what do we do when a coworker is struggling? How do we work with the current culture, institutional culture? How do we bring this up in a good, healthy way?
You know, I heard you say two things here. Heard you say it's a kind of a two-part question. The first part of the question is, what do you do when you know that you have a coworker that's in trouble, or they've told you that they are? But the second part is the part that, you know, kind of raises the bar, and that's when they tell you you can't tell anyone, and that's where you end up in that, you know, in that corner. And, you know, I think people need to be, you know, talking about that long before that incident happens, or that exchange happens. Because what I would say that the response, you know, an appropriate response would be, you know, please, if you want me to help you or you want help, I can't not, you know, move forward with this, you know, unless you're willing to allow me to do that. And there ought to be some options, and you ought to have some organizational options, whether it's an EAP or a access to services that you can refer someone to. There ought to be confidential resources within the community that you can say to that person, look, you know, okay, I'm not going to talk to coworkers or anyone, but I need you to call this number. I need you to speak to these people. I need you to get this assessment or whatever, because you know, if it's a closed system, then you know, then you have nowhere to go. So it really needs to be a system that has some preparedness in dealing with these kinds of you know, these kinds of issues. I think it's across the board, and it ought to be open to people on a regular basis. That's just my thought. What do you think, Dr. Ed?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, but I also, to add, I guess I was thinking of it from where Andrew was, where Andrew took it, which is to the unfortunate correlation of substance use and people in this industry. And I don't think it's by accident. I think it's a byproduct of the pain that one endures in the profession. And it's physical, and it's psychological, and it's emotional, and it's taxing, and it's continuous in many, many, many municipalities. And I think that leads to more physical pain, and that leads to more emotional pain. And for many people who don't have a well-developed emotional life, their emotional pain becomes physical. That physical pain, as we've learned in the last 2 decades, by many doctors, was treated with pain medicines. And then those pain medicines have led to opioid addictions in first responders because they were actually in pain. So, you know, back to the first question about what's a sign of a breaking point in someone, you know, like, yeah, there's a lot of pain going on. And a sign is taking more pain medicine for your pains, needing more pain medicine to begin with, having more physical pain. As far as actually dealing with a person, you know, so much goes into this, you know, the relationship that you have, you know, how close are you with this person, right? That really matters, you know, because if you're going to be, you know, telling on them, so to speak, you want to make sure you're doing it from a place of love and empathy, because you care about them and because you care about the responsibility they have in their work. You know, when you're a doctor and you know another doctor is behaving badly, I can't imagine, no matter how much you like them, you have to address it, because they're in a position where they could hurt people accidentally just because of how they're behaving badly. even if it's accidental. So there's a lot of pressure that goes on when you value strongly the work that they're in, and the potential for an unintended, colossal, bad incident.
You know, and you said so many important things, that it's you know, this whole idea of emotional preparedness, I think is really significant, and I think that it's really important that we continue that, you know, that conversation is continued beyond this webinar, because I really believe that as you pointed out, you know, the incidence and prevalence of some serious illness among first responders right now is a red flag. And some of these, as you know, predated COVID-19, as you know, and so there was already a you know, if you will, challenges that needed to be addressed. And you add COVID-19 and social unrest to that, and my God, you know, you're really looking at the need to have a real aggressive, if you will, response.
Yeah, and not to kind of...
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to add of a personal experience in helping a first responder who was in a similar position. And to your point, the relationship was strong, buddies, I've got your back. And part of the sort of disloyalty that the individual felt was sort of the idea of, you know, basically disclosing to superiors, to the EAP and so on and so forth. And what actually worked was this individual actually guiding the person who was having difficulty into the peer assistance and helping them connect them to both peer assistance and the EAP, so that the individual themselves came to disclose that they were having a challenge, therefore bypassing the whole issue with stigma, which is part of the culture, unfortunately. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's a great point, that a lot of the fears that a person might have about disclosing could be researched by their colleague who cares about them. And so by alleviating their biggest fears, they could be ushered through getting themselves to the proper treatment path if that's what they need.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had this situation just a day ago. It's kind of, you know, it actually in the field that I stomp around in, I come across this on a fairly regular basis, actually. And this was my need to address, you know, and if you want to call it an intervention, I don't do anything but kind interventions which are based on caring. I never get people in a room and scream at somebody. That's really craziness and unethical. I don't do any of that. What I do is, you know, approach somebody with caring and also at the same time with options. And when you do that, when you engage people on that level, you know, and which I had to do, and say to this guy, you know, hey, look, you know, I care about you. That's why I'm talking to you. Here are the options. And here are the consequences, not in a threatening way, but look, you know, because it's typically the secret everyone knows. So, you know, when you're worried, you know, you're often worried about confidentiality, but by the time you're worried about confidentiality, it's often too late, because everybody knows, but nobody is doing what, you know, what Dr. Ed said has to be done. And that is, you need to be able to sit down with that person and be able to have an honest and open and caring discussion, at the same time having options for them to move forward, not just painting them into a corner.
And if it's not you that could have that awesome conversation, then find someone that you are super confident in, that you trust, that could help facilitate this for you. It doesn't have to be you, but you probably know someone who is better than you are at doing this. And that's the beauty of it. It's about how would you do it in the most caring, loving, empathic way, so that it gets the job done, which is to help this person and obviously not to put them in jeopardy with their employment.
Absolutely. We did have a question from the audience. It's an interesting issue, because family is both a protective factor but can also be a stressor, right? And so as I think Dr. Bob started talking about sort of family in a time of COVID, and I'm sort of curious on your thoughts about family impact, both as a protective factor and potentially as a stressor. We do know that the sort of shift work for first responders is incredibly hard for the families, and that unfortunately way more than sort of 50% of marriages amongst first responders end up in divorce. So that can be, again, a double-edged sword. We'd like to hear your thoughts on how to engage with the system, the family system, in the most optimal way.
It's interesting, and as typical, Andrew, it's a fantastic question. So the families of first responders have developed a system to deal with the life of that first responder. In other words, the way that they react to each other, that their patterns of behavior, the way they do life is different because there's a first responder than the way, for instance, the family of someone who's a salesman or whatever might do life. It's very, very different, because they know that the person is going into harm's way. They know that this is, that there's going to be rotating shifts. They know that emergencies are not are typically not on schedule. They can happen anytime. So these families have developed a way to be okay and still deal with that. So that's their kind of, their system. When you throw a wrench into that system, when you add another piece to it, which is what's happened right now, that upsets the entire system. And it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. You have these ripples that go out, and those ripples don't only stop at the family. They go, when you walk into your job, you don't leave your family stuff at the door. You maybe even think you'd like to, but you bring it with you. And then you have the work stuff on top of that. And that the cumulative effect of that, of having those, your family in a chaotic situation, you have your work in a chaotic situation. If you don't find a way to deal with that, and if you don't have the resources to bring that back into a place where that makes sense. Now, very often what that's all about, what that therapy is about, what that intervention is about, is finding new ways to be okay. Because you can't say go, because the knee-jerk reaction is to want to go back to the old way, and we want it to be the old way that worked for us. The problem is the old way doesn't work anymore. So you need to find a new way to be able to deal with the situation, particularly when it's going on for 8, 10, 12 months, years, as opposed to an incident that happened and then it's over.
I heard a story about a father who, at the end of his shift, would, try to put his son to sleep. And it was the most terrible thing, because this kid would fight him for like 2.5 hours. And, he needed his sleep. And he ended up having this terrible relationship with his son. They're always, the only time they saw each other, they fought. And he finally got his way to a therapist somehow, because of many other things probably that were not going well in his life. And the therapist suggested that stop trying to put your kid to sleep and play with him for an hour and a half. Don't even talk about sleep and see what happens. You know, it's the same amount of time spent, actually even less. And instead of fighting, they were playing. And the kids still went to sleep. To your point, Bob, about adjusting and finding a new normal, a new coping. You know, yeah, you might have to eat the fact that it's going to take an hour and a half, but use that hour and a half so that it's a lot more of what you would want to use an hour and a half for instead of fighting with your kid, right? The same goes for, you know, to kind of punctuate a self-care note, you know, stressful lives lead to poor sleep habits. Well, what do you do if you can't fall asleep? You know that if you want rest, you need to sleep. That's been the way you did it. And here you are lying there with a goal of falling asleep and you can't fall asleep. Well, no, the new normal is you're not sleeping. But maybe the best case scenario is, can I lie here in peace and rest? And as soon as you could accept that that could be the next best alternative, the trick of it, the sooner it is you're going to fall asleep, but that's not even the point. The point is you're going to be way more restful and functional the next day than if you were stressed about the fact that you're not sleeping all night.
You know, Dr. Ed, you really bring up such an incredible point here. The other piece of that is that once you get into that place where it's not working anymore and you don't change in some of the ways that you were suggesting, it's not that you stay in that bad place. It's like a snowball running downhill, because you don't sleep, and then you come to work the next day and you make bad decisions. Then you feel bad about making bad decisions, and you're anxious, and you come home, and then your fuse is very short, so you have a temper, and that it just goes on and on. Unless you intervene, unless you do something different, unless you're, as you suggested, change the way that you've been doing things to, create a more supportive atmosphere, you're apt to get into this, deep, dark place and it becomes more and more difficult to get out of it. And it's kind of like the more you scratch to get out of it, the worse it gets. You need to have that time where, you need to stop and do things differently. The other part of that is, very often when we're into it, we don't see those options. We kind of, so many of my patients come to me and say, hey, I've done everything I can do, and it's still not working. And in fact, they haven't done everything they can do. What they've done is the same thing over and over again and expected a different outcome. Unless they come to some place where they're able to explore options, like you were pointing out, where someone not necessarily tells them what to do, but gives them have you tried this? Can you try the? And when they begin to do things differently, the switchboard changes and they get different outcomes.
I'm wondering, those were excellent points, and I'm wondering whether sort of this new normal should also comprise of an assessment of one's own sort of relational dynamics, if you like, with one's family, and to be able to assess whether at any one time of the day is that a sort of resource or an area of stress for me because I have some pending issues that I need to talk about with my wife, and maybe around finances and maybe around healthcare, who knows, but something that is likely to already be stressful. And that sort of some of this new normal is sort of understanding that everybody's baseline is a little bit higher than what it was before, and that again, assessing and evaluating one's own resources and being able to employ them wisely. Wondering your thoughts on that.
All right, so we're going to turn this into like a counseling session, relationship counseling session. When the heat goes up in a relationship, it becomes tougher and tougher to have lies in that relationship. And it becomes that much more simple and simplifiable of a life if you could implement truthful interactions with one another. And I guess, you know, I imagine that when you're in the military, you can't have relationships with the people in your platoon that are not based on truth. You need to be able to rely on each other. You need to trust each other. And in stressful times, I think even a family dynamic experiences the same types of complications. The heat is up, and the less honest and truthful the relationship is, the more you're going to see elements of that bubble up. You know, to pretend that it's not there and it's going to somehow go away, that's not going to work. You know, no one has a perfect relationship, and no one is perfectly honest. That said, working towards that and recognizing that that might be something that is important will pay dividends, because to Dr. Bob, your point, you know, that you've made several times is to the accumulative effect of stress that leads to the breakdowns that, you know, we see. And that accumulative effect needs a system that addresses its intensity, its volume, and the intervention needs to be systematic. So of course, a husband and wife team that improves will improve the relationship of the kids with one another and each other. And that might lead to better interactions with a coworker. When you had a good interaction with your kid in the morning, where maybe normally it's the stressful walk to the bus stop ever.
I couldn't agree with you more. And let's just take what you just said, and now let's jump from the family to the workplace. And I think the same kinds of issues that you're talking about in the family really is, really is replicable in the workplace, because, you know, if you have those kinds of relationships where you can trust, and you at least you're working, as you said, towards authenticity, towards being able to, deal in the most efficient way, because you're able to relate on a very, on that base level. If you can do that, I think, obviously work relationships are not like husband and wife, or wife and wife, or husband and husband, but it's also, there are also relationships that need to be nurtured and need to be developed over time, that allow you to deal with these situations when they come up, and be ready for them. I don't think you can just have that, get to that place and all of a sudden say, we're going to do this. Because if you haven't been doing that, and you already have stressful relationships, and then you put this on top of it, then you're going to be in trouble. But I think you need to, and this goes back to kind of, preparing the workplace, preparing the family, for that incident, whatever that's going to be, so that when it does happen, they're in a much better place, and that they have these means of communication and problem solving that will move them, and it will help them to move forward.
Yeah, one last point before we sound off. We've talked a lot about sort of stressors and crises, and we also know that first responders have developed and a lot of innate resilience, and so do have their families. So how can we sort of really kind of help a first responder to really identify those areas of strength that create resiliency, both within their own individual self, within the workplace, and recognize those sort of areas of resiliency within their family members, so that it's focused on that, and they are able to draw and withdraw from that bank account, if you like.
Andrew, I practice something called positive psychology, and what that means is that when I'm working with a patient, what I'm doing is building on their strengths, not identifying their weaknesses, as and I do both, but my pathway forward in dealing with people. And there's more than one way to get from point A to B, and I'm not saying mine is the best, but it's the way that I work. And I agree with you that, you know, resiliency is just one of those kinds of attributes that you can help to, you know, to build on, that you can help to fine tune and help, you know, in terms of someone moving forward. And I think you're right, Andrew. I think there are, you know, you need to balance, you know, what is wrong with what is right, and make sure you're building on what's right while you're addressing what's wrong.
It sort of reminded me of an episode just recently where I had a conversation with the spouse of a new police officer. You know, as often happens within sort of law enforcement community, she was embraced by some of the other families. But what she was remarking on is that, you know, she was very, very clear that there was a culture of, you know, this is sort of your lot as a wife of a law enforcement officer, and this is the culture, and this is how we sort of support each other. But it seemed more like a closed system, and what she was relating was that she was questioning this way of being a support to her husband and this sort of culture. And to me, it's a reminder that we can find resiliency not just within ourselves, but within any sort of group of people or agency that we're involved in, and B, that we're advocates for change. And any one of us can be an advocate for change in any organization, regardless of how sort of heavy the task feels. And with that, I wanted to sort of just get some closing thoughts from the both of you.
Well, I really like the focus on resilience, because in a way, if we're going to talk about, you know, we're trying to start the conversation about self-care, that is exactly what self-care is addressing. It's addressing our resilience to the impacts, the biological impacts of work stress in this particular case, right? And life stress, family stress. And so that is the model, you know, certainly prisoners of war. It was very clear that the ones that survived and thrived, like Senator McCain, followed very important principles. And there were physician scientists that did this research and distilled it, and for the last few decades have been working on, you know, this resilience model to depression, or resilience model to post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on, you know, and there's a lot of things that go into it. You ask Navy SEALs, they have a very low incidence of PTSD compared to other people, and it has a lot to do with who's inflicting the pain and who's the decider of a mission, and things like that too. So there's many factors, but in any situation, certainly within the construct of a family, there are strengths that people already have, and identifying them and having that conversation will lead to exercises to further develop those strengths. And I think that's where you were kind of leading to with this. And I think that is kind of the further conversations to have, you know. We need better sleep. We need better family relationships. We need to be in better physical health. You know, we need to be able to eat better. We need to be able to recognize that we're going to have a stressful day, and maybe meditation, as weird as that might sound of a practice, might be a very helpful thing that would actually help our resilience with the stressful situations we're going to endure.
I agree with everything that Dr. Ed just said.
Well, I agree with myself.
Sorry, I was speaking on mute. Thank you, Dr. Ed. Thank you, Dr. Bob. Thank you for those of you in the audience. Please tell your colleagues. Please encourage participation. And we look forward to our next session with you. Thanks. Bye-bye.